To the next flipped video, we are going to pick up in this discussion about the Crusades. So just to give a little background to make sure we're all starting this discussion in the same place, just a reminder that the Crusades were a series of religious wars that were fought between 1095 and 1270. These wars were fought between the European Christians, and note that I said Christians, not Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, because we're coming back to that, and the Muslim empires of the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids of Cairo. So just to remind ourselves, at this time we had the East and West schism. So we had the Eastern Orthodox Christians had recently broken apart from the Western European Catholics, and here in the Byzantine Empire, just to get a little um, geography here, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I, he was getting a little bit of pressure here from the incoming Seljuk Turks. Remember, this is political. We're talking governments, we're talking soldiers and military. So the political leader, the Emperor Alexius I, he called upon the Pope over here in Western Europe for some minor help. So we have the Eastern Orthodox Empire asking the Western European Catholics for help. And he was doing so against this growing Sunni Seljuk Turk Empire. Well, Pope Urban II, the leader at the time, sees this as an opportunity because he sees this opportunity to reunite these Eastern Orthodox and Western European Christian or Catholics under one single rule. So rather than just starting and sending a few soldiers to help, he in fact unites all Christians under his rule, calling for a full out war against Islam, which was again not the original intention from Alexius I. So ultimately, Pope Urban II is able to create this force of Christians, and he launches what are known then as the Crusades. And he says that the Crusades, the purpose of the Crusades, is not just simply to help Alexius I recapture his kingdom, but instead he says that the mission of the Crusades is to end Muslim control of the Christian Holy Land of Jerusalem and establish Christian leadership. So he completely changes the entire objective of this discussion to unite Christians and to claim that the Muslims have captured the Holy Land of Jerusalem, which was true, it was under their control. But again, he has just completely reoriented and manipulated the entire situation for his own benefit and to regain political control. And so when he gives this call to arms that you all read, Pope Urban II's speech, the people who primarily responded were the peasants, specifically because he had promised them that he would absolve them all of their sins, that if you go on the crusade and you die on the crusade, that you would be completely forgiven of your sins. So he pulls a religious call here. He even says that Christ commanded that all Christians answer this call to arms. So again, manipulating that religious authority. He financially motivated the serfs as well, because he promised them if they would go on these crusades, that the serfs would gain land in the Holy Lands, they would become rich, they would no longer have to be serfs. So he manipulates their position with that as well, and thousands of people respond. During the Crusade, so what actually happened? The very first crusade actually captured the city of Jerusalem here in Israel. Again, this is the Holy Land of Christianity. It's also the Holy Land of Jerusalem. It's also Holy Land to Muslims. Muslims believe that Muhammad died here in Jerusalem, so it's also a holy place for them. But the First Crusade recaptured Jerusalem, captured Jerusalem by the Christians, but very shortly thereafter, the Muslim leader Salahuddin or Saladin, both acceptable pronunciations, Saladin of Egypt very shortly thereafter recaptures Jerusalem for the Muslims. Saladin was known as a very strong leader and an extremely tolerant leader, which is important because when we see the way the historical record from different perspectives reads about the Crusades, we see that there's a very different portrayal of Saladin, and specifically a very different portrayal of Muslims that is different from the tolerance that Saladin showed towards the conquering Christians. Once he had recaptured Jerusalem, he was quite clear that Christians must be protected and that they must be allowed to live in peace within this land. Sadly, the conquering Crusaders did not show that same tolerance to the Muslims that they invaded. It also says that he was a very pious Muslim. A lot of his tolerance stemmed from the fact that he was extremely religious by nature, very tolerant, and very much adhered to his faith in Islam. over the course of the Crusades. So I already mentioned, you can see on this map that the Crusades, there were many, many Crusades. You can see the first one was for 3 years, so the next one for 2 years, next one for 3 years, and they would go on and on and on. So the Crusades would occur, then someone would revive this concept of the Crusades, they would go away, they'd be revived. Ultimately, by the end, the Crusades, this concept of going on a Christian crusade to recapture the Holy Land, really became entangled, meaning twisted together, with all other political and religious goals. So, for example, people began using this concept of taking the Crusades in order to accomplish different objectives. For example, at one point, Crusades took on a very anti-Semitic twist, which means anti-Jewish twist, which is really counterintuitive to this concept of recapturing the Holy Land, given that Jews and Christians were all Abrahamic faiths, as is Islam. But there was a strong rise of anti-Semitism that became entangled in the Crusades. And many Jews were killed in all across Europe, both in Western Europe and in the Byzantine Empire, because people misused or I guess justified their actions, saying that if Muslims were pagans, then Jews too must be pagans. So we saw some horrific violence emerging here in the early Crusades that sadly will reemerge, or rather remain consistent in Europe for many years to come. The Crusaders, just to show you the depth with which the Crusades became far from their original purpose, flawed as that purpose was, Crusaders even attacked a Christian city of Constantinople as a result of financial disputes between leaders. So clearly we see that the Crusades just became a overarching military goal that veered far away from this original Pope Urban II goal, which again was flawed to begin with. Even so, the later Crusades, you can see that even the later Crusades, they weren't even aimed at Jerusalem. Many of those Crusades actually went down into Egyptian and Tunis areas here, specifically because they wanted to get trading routes back. So again, this concept of the Crusades just being about the Holy Land, even just being about religion, just became completely muddied and confusing by the end of the Crusades. The reason for those two Crusades down to Jerusalem and Egypt and Tunis, was because the Italian merchants here in Italy, they wanted to control this trans-Sahara trade, and they wanted access to the Far East trade routes going all the way to China that we've already discussed. So again, Crusades by the end had become effectively an excuse to utilize this large, massive Christian military force to accomplish political and economic gain. So ultimately, by the end, what were the Crusades? What were the effects? First, the effects there were already existing connections between Europe and the Islamic world before the Crusades, but the Crusades really emphasized the differences between the two civilizations. We could see that the Islamic Empire had been thriving. Don't forget about the golden age of Islam there. And now we start to see that there's a strong, strong difference between the golden age and the scholarship and the accomplishments of the Islamic Empire as compared to the falling and disintegrating fall of the Roman Empire, and in turn the feudal society of Europe. So in other words, we see a strong, strong, strong contrast between the thriving societies of Islam and the essentially disintegrating area there in Western Europe. Jerusalem ultimately flipped back and forth between Muslim and Christian control all the way through the 15th century, and ultimately ended in Muslim control. Saladin, when he captured it in the Fourth Crusades, it ultimately remained within Muslim control. And to this day, Jerusalem is now actually a split city, but is within the state of Israel, which is the Jewish state. Okay. Wait, no. And we'll pause right there for just a second. Okay, sorry, we had to switch PowerPoints right there. So as I said, the Christian soldiers, they took back Jerusalem, but then the Muslims got it and kept it, and more Crusades were fought. Christians never regained the Holy Land. So picking up the effects there, the Crusades, as I mentioned, there already were existing contact between Europe and the Islamic world, but the Crusades brought all kinds of cultural diffusion and really introduced new ideas to Western Europe, specifically coming from Islam. Right? For example, the Crusades helped increase desires for luxury goods like silk and cotton, sugar, spices, all the things that we've been learning about that were traded across the Trans-Sahara trade route and the Silk Road. The Crusades also introduced technologies like the compass, the astrolabe, the ship designs, gunpowder, again, all coming from the civilizations that we've already studied, the Islamic world, the African world, and the Islamic world and African world in this instance would be the same, the Islamic world and the East Asian empires. It also introduced the ideas like the Arabic numbers, chemistry, algebra, all that Islamic scholarship that we spent some time learning about. We see that the Christians are, in fact, learning from the Islamic society and, in fact, utilizing this Muslim scholarship within their own societies as they return back to their homes. Um, during the Middle Ages, during the Middle Ages, only it was the priests who could read and write. So remember that the church was the center of education. But after the Crusades, learning increased and more people became educated. So we saw that there was the influence of Greek ideas, Roman ideas, their own people's ideas, right? So Greek and Rome came from Europe, yet it was the Muslim scholars who had been preserving those works. So the Crusaders were going to the Islamic world and effectively bringing back ideas about their own civilization from this Islamic scholarship. Medieval fairs brought. I'm sorry, actually move that. Nope, that's not what I want. There we go. In the Middle Ages, it was the fairs that brought iron and salt to the manors, and this was very rare to have iron and salt. Yet after the Crusades, people wanted more luxury goods, so they got to trade more. So we see the expansion of those trading systems. As more and more people trade, we actually start to see the revival of cities because of the demand for the goods from far away. So when after the fall of the Roman Empire and everyone moved out to the rural areas, after the Crusades, we actually start to see the growth of the empires again. Most importantly, the failures of the Crusades decrease the power of the church and the Pope. When the Crusades didn't work, when people didn't get absolved of all their forgiveness, or the Crusade didn't bring riches and didn't actually capture the Holy Land, people actually began to distrust to become distrustful of the church and specifically of the leadership of the Pope. Lords and knights lost power as they sold their lands because they were raising money to fight for the Crusades. Kings, though, began to increase their power. See how that worked? Because the lords and the knights lost power, they were selling their land to raise money to fight in the Crusades. As they sell the land, do you see how there's now a more direct connection between kings and the peasants themselves? In that way, kings were able to centralize their power and began to actually form what we consider the modern day countries and modern day nations. So we start to see the breakdown of this system of feudalism. More specifically, the peasants themselves, as they go on these crusades, as people return from the crusades, they are no longer satisfied with being just this system of knights and lords and nobles and kings. They start to demand more power in their society. So we again too start to see the beginnings of feudalism falling apart. So the Crusades, quite significant, very flawed in their initial purposes, yet we ultimately see that this has a tremendous impact on European society. All right, we'll wrap it up there.